Last week, Terry preached through John 17, which some people call the high priestly prayer of Jesus. And that chunk of John 17, is the very last part of a scene that actually begins way back in like the middle of chapter 13. And if you got one of those red letter Bibles where Jesus' words are all in red, they're highlighted in red, there's an awful lot of red in those chapters. In fact, those chapters are all red. It's like 4.5 chapters of pure red all the way down. And that ends here at the beginning of chapter 18 as we return to the narrative portion, the story part of the gospel. That last bit of Jesus' very long speech, that high priestly prayer, is all about the unity of believers in Jesus. Jesus prays for his followers, both his immediate disciples, his disciples at that time, but also for all of his future followers, including us. And in his prayer, he asks God that God will make us one in Jesus as he and the Father are one. He prays that the love that the Father has for Jesus will be the love that characterizes our lives, that God's love will be in us. And it's a beautiful prayer. It's an inspiring prayer. It fills me with hope when I read it, and it reminds me of our ultimate destiny, that our ultimate destiny is in God. But, and always a but, right? but, I still got to live in this world. This is still the place where I am. This world that's filled with danger and pain and suffering, filled to the brim with people like me who are imperfect and often hurting and so prone to hurt others. And it turns out that we see the same thing in Jesus' story in this next chapter, in chapter 18. As soon as his prayer is over, Jesus goes with his disciples to an olive grove. And this place has been like a regular meeting place for them. They hang out here on the regular, John tells us. And that's when Judas shows up again, right? So Judas was here earlier. He slipped out of the upper room and vanished for a while. Judas is back. Except for now, he's back with a bunch of Roman and Jewish troops, soldiers, in order to identify Jesus so that they can arrest Jesus. The beauty of the ideals of Jesus' prayer for unity runs smack dab into the wall of Judas and his human frailty and his fragility. And for the rest of the chapter, we're going to get a series of scenes where Jesus' behavior is contrasted with everybody around him. So we're going to try to watch Jesus and compare him. Jesus' disciples, his accusers, the religious officials, the representatives of the imperial government, all of these people act in very human, which is to say, very crappy ways. And in the middle of all this is Jesus. Jesus is going to stand in the middle of this entire story. And in each scene, we're going to get to compare and contrast his actions with the actions of the people around him. Jesus will show us what it means to say that he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that will help us in turn to understand what it means to be a follower of the person who calls himself the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. To be a follower of Jesus, to depend on the grace of God. So, scene 1 is the Olive Garden. Jesus is there with an unknown number of disciples, but at least the 11 core disciples and probably a whole bunch of other people based on stories in the other Gospels. There's probably a bit of a crowd. And Judas arrives with a cohort of soldiers. Now, we don't know the exact number, but it's a bunch. Right? A cohort is a lot of soldiers. That's likely because there's an expectation that Jesus and his followers might turn violent. The Roman and the Jewish leaders don't understand Jesus. They just don't understand him. The Romans especially probably see him as like a potential revolutionary, so they're not taking any chances. They're going to bring this big group of soldiers, and leading that group is Judas. Now, we don't really know anything about Judas' internal psychology. The text doesn't tell us that much. We don't really know that much about him, actually. If you read through all the Gospels, they don't tell us that much about him. John has painted a picture of him as like a greedy man, a thief who pinches from the common money that Jesus and the disciples share in their travels together. But why is he betraying Jesus? Is it for the money? Maybe. It's quite possible. Is it for some other motivation? Also possible. We often imagine that Judas started out as like an authentic believer, a follower of Jesus, who became jaded as Jesus did not turn out to be the conquering Messiah that he hoped for, but that's a bit of a guess. I mean, it's entirely possible, though. But John doesn't really tell us. Whatever his motivations, Judas has taken a bribe to show the soldiers where Jesus is. Which, of course, nobody needed to do. Jesus is not hiding. He's in a place that he goes to all the time. He's hanging out with people he hangs out with literally all the time. These are the only guys he ever hangs out with. And when the soldiers show up, do they have to try to figure out which one of these guys is Jesus? No. In fact, in this version, Jesus speaks first. He asks them, who are they looking for? And they say, Jesus. And he says, that's me. The religious leaders probably could have saved themselves 30 pieces of silver here. He's not a very hard guy to find. Now, what's the comparison we're supposed to know? Judas, a regular person who's given in to this human weakness, betrays a mentor who was only ever deeply loving to him. Jesus, the King of Kings, stands entirely unafraid in front of a cohort of Roman soldiers and immediately surrenders himself to them without a fight. Surrounded by followers and soldiers and confronted with the betrayal of a friend who he's journeyed with for years, Jesus does not deny or equivocate or delay. I am he, he says. Now, the I am he, probably a reference to Jesus' divinity and unity with the Father. As Terry mentioned several times in his sermons on John this year, Jesus uses this I am formula as a reminder of God's divine name, which is Yahweh, which means I am that I am, or something like that. The moment Jesus says this, John tells us that the people around him draw back and they fall to the ground. Well, I'm sure none of them could have articulated it. They've come to arrest God in human form. And when they meet him, they are, to borrow the old King James phrasing from the Christmas stories, they are sore afraid. The thing is, what's Jesus doing to cause this reaction? Is his glory shining forth? It doesn't look like it. Has he done some kind of amazing miracle? The text doesn't mention anything. So what has he done? In the midst of the chaos of this scene, confronted by a cohort of soldiers and the betrayal of his friend, he's just calm and unafraid. And he just surrenders himself. Judas and the soldiers are so discombobulated. Sorry, I like the word discombobulated. They're so discombobulated that Jesus has to ask them again who they're looking for. He says, I am he, and they fall down, and it's like, who are you guys looking for? And they say Jesus again, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus tells them again, I am he. He also tells them to let his disciples go because he's surrendering peacefully and willingly. But of course, that's when Peter has a little freak out, right? Poor Peter. We're so hard on poor Peter. But of course, he's also such a dummy sometimes. This is a second clear point of contrast we're supposed to notice in this chapter. Jesus, calm, collected, patient, speaking to the soldiers without any sense of panic or any sense of worry. He is compared to Peter, who sees his dear friend about to be arrested, which is, something Jesus did tell him was going to happen. But he sees that Jesus is about to be arrested, and that Jesus is going to surrender peacefully. And then he takes it upon himself to draw his sword and attack. And famously, he cuts off the ear of this poor slave named Malchus. So, he didn't even attack a soldier. And he also pretty clearly missed. I can't imagine he was aiming for the ear. It seems really obvious that Peter's he's given into panic, right? He's freaking out. In this way, he's not a lot different from Judas. Peter has ideas about who Jesus is and who Jesus is supposed to be and what's supposed to happen next. And arrest at the hands of the religious leadership and the empire, not part of Peter's plans. But unfortunately, he doesn't seem to be able to notice or realize or accept that it is a part of Jesus' plan, because it's a part of God's plan. John doesn't tell us this, but the other gospel writers tell us that Jesus heals the slave's ear, which is nice of him. Thank you, Jesus. Good. And he tells Peter, put the sword away, man. This cup, he says, which the Father has given to me, should I not drink it? This cup which the Father has given to me, should I not drink it, he says. Jesus repeats a theme he's been trying to teach his disciples all the way through John's Gospels. He has not come to do his own will or the will of any other human being. He's come to do God's will. But the chaos and the disorder of the scene in the Olive Garden is reflected in the chaos and the disorder of Peter's heart. He's afraid, and he's anxious, and he's panicky, so he's doing what we so often do when we're filled with anxiety, or at least I know what I often do when I'm filled with anxiety. He's trying to reach out and take control of the situation, a situation that nobody's asking him to take control of. But just as Jesus reacted with calm words for the soldiers, he reacts with calm words for his poor, anxious friend. Peter, put the sword away. This cup, which the Father has given to me, should I not drink it? Our next scene is actually two scenes that kind of run parallel to each other. The main focus is Jesus, who's now taken away by the Romans in front of the religious leaders. And at the same time, Peter and an unnamed disciple, who's probably John, have followed behind Jesus and the soldiers and ended up in the courtyard outside of where the religious leaders are gathered. Outside, Peter is confronted by the slave watching the door, and he's accused of being one of Jesus' disciples. So just for context, just think for a second. 2 verses ago, we were in the Olive Garden. They've walked from the Olive Garden into the city, and between there and now, this person asks Peter, aren't you one of his disciples? And Peter says, no. He denies it. Peter. Poor Peter. From bluster to fear-induced violence and then to betrayal in a matter of literally hours. It's easy to roll our eyes at him, but if we're being honest, or if I'm being honest with myself, I think that most of us understand that behavior from personal experience. I've definitely done things like this. Inside, Jesus is brought first before a man named Annas. Now, Annas is not the high priest. He's the former high priest, and he's the father-in-law of the current high priest, a guy named Caiaphas. We should probably imagine Annas as like an older, very well-respected, very politically connected person who is kind of like the real power behind the high priest. He questions Jesus first about his teachings, and Jesus is open and frank and arguably a little bit sassy, depending on how you read it. And he says that he's been teaching in public this whole time. Annas can just kind of ask anybody what he's been teaching if he wants to know what it's been about, and that earns him a smack from a guard, seemingly for being disrespectful. Jesus is like, show me what I did wrong. And if you can't show me what I did wrong, maybe you could explain why you're smacking me. Annas has no recorded response to that. Now, this scene has all the hallmarks of a kangaroo court. Jesus is not accused of anything specific because he actually hasn't done anything wrong. And the leaders who are present try to bully him into some kind of confession, but just like in the olive grove, Jesus is calm and unafraid. He answers the questions, and he isn't cowed by their violence. They can't make him lie, and they can't make him afraid. Annas sends him along to the actual high priest Caiaphas. We don't get to see that scene, but something happens there. And then we jump back to Peter in the meantime. And Peter is warming himself by a brazier or fire, and someone asks him again, aren't you one of his disciples? And Peter says, no. One of the people standing there is a slave of the high priest and is related to the kid who got his ear cut off. And he says, wait, didn't I see you with Jesus in the olive grove? So he was clearly amongst those people. And Peter again denies his relationship with Jesus, and a rooster crows. John doesn't give a lot of time to the story. It's like 3 sentences. Jesus is being contrasted in these scenes in 2 directions at the same time. First to the religious leaders, and then to one of his own disciples. The religious leaders are liars and cheats. They're manipulating the trial in order to save themselves from a person that they think might start a rebellion against their Roman masters. Peter is afraid, and he can't live up to his earlier bluster or bravado. Between the leaders and the disciples, Jesus stands again, calm, unafraid. He is where he is supposed to be. He won't admit to any false charges. He won't lie to save his skin. Next, we find Jesus dragged before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Now, sometimes people present this picture of Pilate as like a thoughtful, kind, even-keeled ruler who's sympathetic to Jesus' situation. I don't think that's actually a very good read historically on Pontius Pilate. We know about Pilate from the Gospels. We also know about him from the writings of Josephus, who's like a Jewish Roman historian. Pilate was a pretty typical Roman ruler. He was hard. He was extraordinarily violent. He was callous, and he was pragmatic. He is a pragmatic man. He didn't care much about anything beyond his job, which was to maintain the peace so that he could collect taxes. Taxes are the thing for Pilate. If we get the taxes, we're good. If we don't get the taxes, somebody's get their head bashed in. That's how it works, okay? If he had to commit violence to do it, he'd commit violence to do it. If he had to seem reasonable and considerate to the customs of the Jews, even though he thought that they were silly, he would do that. He would seem reasonable. You get the sense, though, that he's more than a little exasperated with the local religious politics in Jerusalem. Basically, in every story about Pilate, you get that sense, that he's very oh, these people. That's Pilate's attitude generally to his posting, I think. The religious leaders bring Jesus to the Praetorium, which is the official office of the Roman governor, but they won't enter the Praetorium because they think that will make them ceremonially unclean. And so this is Pilate being okay, I'll go outside. Pilate comes out to talk to them. I usually read his behavior here as deeply annoyed. That's how I read him in this entire scene, deeply annoyed. He asks what the charge against Jesus is, and they answer, they wouldn't have brought him if he wasn't an evildoer. In other words, they don't have a charge against him. He's a bad guy. That's the charge against him. Pilate responds by telling them okay, take him and punish him yourself. Take Jesus and punish him yourself. I don't care. They reply that they're not allowed to put people to death. What's going on here? So the religious leaders are pretty obviously trying to get Pilate and the Romans to do their dirty work for them. We don't really know whether or not it was legal for the people of Jerusalem to put people to death without Roman license. But remember that in the Gospel of John, there's a really, really famous story earlier in the book when a woman is dragged in front of Jesus because she committed adultery, right? And the religious leaders who were there were pretty obviously ready to stone her to death, which suggests that whether it was legal or not, Jewish religious executions probably happened sometimes. Also note that such an execution would normally be stoning. That's if you're going to execute somebody according to the law, you stone them. That's the normal way of doing it. You throw stones at them until they're dead. Only Romans crucify people. Crucifixion is there are other civilizations that did it here and there. They learned it from the Romans, and nobody crucifies like the Romans. It sounds like an awful thing to say. They're real good at it, though. Only the Romans do this. So the religious leaders don't really want to be fully responsible for stoning Jesus, probably because they're afraid of public backlash, or maybe because they're afraid of Roman retaliation. Maybe they're afraid of both. So they just, they want this to happen. They don't want to do it. But Pilate's also pretty uninterested, isn't he? He's been in Jerusalem a long time. He's been here long enough to understand the politics and the religious issues. And he seems to find the religious stuff pretty boring. He's basically telling the leaders that nobody's going to give them any grief if they just kind of do their dirty work themselves. He's go, I don't care. Go do your thing. But they don't want to do their own dirty work. They want Roman skin in the game. So, exasperated, Pilate turns to Jesus. Let's read this one straight out of the text because it's a little bit of a longer chunk. But this is chapter 18, verses 33 to 38. And, I was going to read out of a translation I don't want to read out of. Let's read out of the NRSV. That's a better translation. Okay. So, then Pilate entered the headquarters again, the Praetorium, and summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" And Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation, the chief priests that have handed over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What's truth?" After he said this, he went out to find the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against this man." People make a big deal out of Pilate's dismissal of truth. What's truth? But I think there's actually two things to note here. First, Pilate is very much rolling his eyes at this entire situation. His tone is very much truth. Give me a break, man. What are we talking about here? But also, John is being intentional with his construction of this story. We know what truth is because we've been reading the Gospel of John. And Jesus has already talked about this a whole bunch. Jesus is the truth. People who really and truly recognize what's going on see Jesus and they understand that he is the way and he is the truth and he is the life. Unfortunately, at this point in the story, we've basically run out of people who really and truly recognize what's going on, except for Jesus. Pilate obviously thinks that the entire thing is entirely ridiculous, but he's also just too pragmatic to take any kind of principled stand on behalf of Jesus. He's not going to do that. He tells the religious leaders that he doesn't find any fault with Jesus, but to placate them, to calm them down, he's willing to make them a deal. "I'll make you a deal," he says. He'll release a Jewish prisoner in honor of the Passover. He apparently does this regularly. And he's going to let them, in this case, he's going to let them choose. So, I always release a prisoner. I'll let you guys choose this year who you want me to let go. You can choose to release Jesus, this very clearly innocent dude standing here, or you can have this guy named Barabbas, who is referred to as a robber or a thief. He's very obviously legitimately a criminal. They choose Barabbas. We've just seen our final point of comparison. Jesus and Pilate are in front of us, and we can see in Pilate a man who is only interested in political and military power and the empire. The truth isn't his problem. Innocence isn't his problem. Right and wrong, it's not my problem, man. Get away from me. All other things being equal, he would have obviously released Jesus. But, of course, all other things are not equal. Shrug. What are you going to do? That's very much his attitude. And again, Jesus is calm and prepared. He doesn't plead. He doesn't beg. He makes no impassioned speech. He doesn't really attempt to persuade Pilate at all. Jesus knows what is coming next. His Father has placed a task in front of him. Jesus is going to see it through. Pilate doesn't really care who he releases. So when push comes to shove, he lets a robber go and he sends the King of Kings to be whipped and beaten. And before we reflect on this chapter, we actually have to take a quick look at just the first 3 verses of the next chapter, of chapter 19. The reason for this is because chapters 18 and 19 of John are actually one big, long unit. We're just doing the first half. It's a big, long unit divided into 2, and it has a center point. And that center point is not John 18:40, the end of chapter 18. The center point is actually John 19:3. It's the end of the first half and the beginning of the second half. Why? Well, in verse 1, Jesus is whipped by the Romans. And in verse 2, the soldiers put a cruel thorn crown on his head, and they wrap him in a purple robe. The purple signifies royalty. And then in verse 3, they smack him around, they beat him, and they mock him, and, this is the key thing, they call him the King of the Jews. They call him the King of the Jews. Now, the King of all kings, the King of the Jews, the King of a kingdom that is not of this world, the King who is God himself, now this King has been crowned. This is Jesus coronation. The soldiers mean the crown to be ironic, and of course there's lots of irony in the chapter, but this crown is not one of the ironies. That crown is real. This is the real moment in which Jesus of Nazareth is crowned king over all of creation. And that truth should tell us everything that we need to know about what it means to be a follower of this king, when and where he's crowned. Let's review. We've considered 3 successive scenes where Jesus interacts with and he's compared to other people in this story. In scene 1, chaos rules as Judas betrays Jesus and Peter tries to cut a slave's ear off. But in the midst of that chaos, Jesus is completely calm. He doesn't run, he doesn't fight, he doesn't argue or deny his identity. I am he, is his answer. In scene 2, Jesus is subject to an absurd trial in quotation marks, we could probably say. His accusers try to bully him into confessing something, but the truth is, he really hasn't done anything. His disciple who promised everlasting faithfulness is denying that he ever knew Jesus, even as Jesus is being smacked around for telling the truth. But Jesus will not deny himself. Jesus will not speak falsely. He will not be pushed into some kind of frantic self-defense. And then finally, Jesus is brought in front of Pilate, an uninterested, practically minded servant of the imperial violence of Rome. Again, Jesus will only speak the simple truth. He won't beg. He won't grovel. He won't make any attempt to get himself out of this situation. And that's it in a nutshell. Jesus won't do anything to get himself out of this situation because he knows perfectly well that this is the situation that he is supposed to be in. This situation has been coming the entire time. Remember what he said to Peter, "This is the cup my Father has given to me. Should I not drink it?" When faced with chaos or uncertainty, Jesus is calm because he is about his Father's business. But what about when we are faced with chaos and uncertainty? What if, for example, off the top of my head, we find ourselves in a church that doesn't have a lead pastor, as an immediate example? You might feel a sense of confusion or uncertainty about that and about the future. You might feel like this is a bad situation, or you might feel like this is a good situation, or you might not be sure if it's a good situation or a bad situation. You might feel relieved, you might feel hurt. You might not understand what the fuss is all about. And I want to be clear, I'm not here to police anybody's emotions. And if you want to talk about how you're feeling about all this, one way or the other, all of the members of the Elders Board, like I said before, are happy to listen to you. I'm happy to listen to you. Just reach out. But I will say this. This church is not now, and never has been, and never could be, without its pastor. And I'm not actually, maybe it sounds like I'm saying a nice thing about our staff. I love our staff. I'm not talking about them. The true pastor of this church was and is and always will be the same. The true pastor of the church wears a royal robe that's stained with blood and a crown of twisted and terrible thorns on his head. The true pastor of this church can stand in the middle of chaos, in the midst of confusion, in the midst of the will of misguided or uninterested or evil people, and remain entirely calm. Because the true pastor of this church, the true pastor of this church is about his Father's business right now. And maybe all that stuff is not troubling you at all because, frankly speaking, you have bigger troubles. You have bigger fears. You have scarier chaos in your lives. Work, kids, money, relationships, health. There's a lot of worry to go around, man. I know that. But again, it isn't like Jesus was low on things to worry about in his life. But he knew that these worries existed in the context of his life with God. His worries were never gone in this story. His worries were anything but gone, but they had a specific place in the story, and Jesus knew which bit of the story he was in and whose story he was in. And because of this, Jesus could prayerfully submit his terrible path. The path that's coming next is truly awful. And Jesus could submit this terrible path prayerfully and willingly to God. And he could stand fast in the midst of his trials and his persecution. So while we might feel the very understandable pull to run away, like most of the disciples did, or to lash out in fear and anger like Peter did, or to betray like Judas did, or to fabricate accusations like the religious leaders did, or to shrug our shoulders and like cold pretend disinterest like Pilate did. Well, we can feel all those temptations. Jesus goes before us as the example of a holy life lived in the midst of uncertainty and chaos. Hebrews chapter 12 calls Jesus the author and the perfecter of our faith. And that means that in a time of difficulty, the one that we look to isn't any human leader or any political party or any theological idea. The one that we look to is none other than the King of Kings himself, our true pastor, our living hope, the author and the perfecter of our faith. Our hope, our goal, our desire as Christians in this time and in this place is very, very simple. Like Jesus, wherever it takes us, we are meant to be about our Father's business. Pray with me. God of grace and God of glory, we are deeply, deeply thankful that in the midst of the chaos of our lives, you are calm. And that your peace, a peace that you says passes understanding, a peace that is so often a mystery to us, that your peace is available to us. My prayer for us as a church is that in the midst of a difficult and chaotic time, you will grant us this sense of peace and trust. May we trust in you. May we look to you as our true King, our true leader, our true shepherd, our true pastor, and follow you in all things. Grant that we will know you, that we will know you more deeply as we depend upon you in difficult times. Pray these things in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.